Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a regular session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. The date is Tuesday, April 25th, 2023. The time is 7 p.m. The first item on our agenda is roll call. Joe Murphy.
Here.
Susan Axelrod.
Here.
Paul Jordan.
Here.
Robin Pothier.
Here.
Peter DiStefano. Here. Elizabeth Karp.
Here.
And Maria Mack is here. Our next agenda item consists of the consent agenda. This includes approval of minutes, March 21st, 2023 work session, March 28th, 2023 regular session, development plan review for person, proposal for single-family residential development of an existing lot on Ministerial Road. Also, major subdivision request to combine stages of review, Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd, and the report of the administrative officer. If there are no additions or corrections to the consent agenda, would someone like to make a motion to approve same?
I'll make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
We have a motion from Susan, we have a second from Paul. Is there a further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Our next agenda item is a request for extension of preliminary plan approval, major subdivision Heritage Estates. Request to extend final plan approval for Phase 2, consisting of 4 lots of the major subdivision as originally approved on June 6, 2013. Is there anyone representing the applicant?
Dominic Grassi, 50 Monticelli Drive in West Kingston, representing Grassi Estates, LLC. I think this will be our last. I want to express our appreciation for having been granted extensions up to now. We're in the process of engaging an attorney to do the final recordings. The only reason we are applying for this extension is because we don't think that it'll get done by June 30th, which is the last day of the last extension we received.
Can you give the board an assurance that you would have it done within the year's time?
Well, I can. As far as I know, there is no reason why it won't get done. Our goal right now, having talked with our attorney, is September would be the time that we'll be doing the recording. There was some issues with Phase 1, not with the planning board or nothing, but with title to the properties, and he wants to revisit all of those things, and so he said he won't be ready by June 30th. That was the reason for the extension. I don't see any reason. We've already decided that the LLC is going to be dissolved. You were here from the beginning, Maria, and you know it was a family thing, and we finally decided what we're going to do with the 4 lots that are left, and how they're going to be recorded, whose name they're going to be recorded, and so even though there's no plan to build, we decided to dissolve the LLC, and so we have to record the lots this year. As I said, I can say to you that as far as I know in my own mind, those lots will definitely be recorded by the end of September. I can't, and not knowing the reasons that the lawyer wants to revisit some of the other things, so I can't assure you that with 100% certainty, but as far as I can see, it will be. I don't know if our attorney may have even contacted Jay. Did our attorney contact you? No? Okay. He said he was going to soon. No, nothing, huh? Okay.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions from board members? We do have a draft motion on page 2 of the staff comments for this item.
Madam Chair, just one comment based
Sure.
on the explanation that the landowner gave today, that he's concerned about the June 1st date and said he anticipated wrapping this up in September.
Mhm.
So perhaps a 6-month extension is warranted, which would get them to the first of the year. This has been going on for multiple years.
I mean, I don't have a problem with a year. It sounds like the applicant is having to rely on the schedule of his attorney, which, of course, none of us have any control over, so I don't see a problem with,
Maria, if you don't mind, I'm a little offended. You know our background.
you.
You know, since we started working with Dennis, we have always done everything the city has asked us to do, including the 20,000-gallon water tank, which you probably remember the history behind that. We have never, anything Dennis or any of the planners had ever asked us to do, you know, we just did it. And there's no reason why this will go past September. So if you want to give us 6 months, fine, but it's just,
Yes, I certainly recall the history, and you were one of the real actual families that did a residential compound such as this, and you were not professional developer folks, and it obviously takes longer for you know, when you're getting introduced to that kind of a project.
whatever you decide, we appreciate all the help that
Yes.
we've received from all the planners that we've worked with.
I'm prepared to make the motion as written.
Okay,
South Kingstown Planning Board hereby grants an extension of the final plan approval for Phase 2 of the Heritage Estates major subdivision located at AP 8-4, Lot 20, AP 13-1, Lot 54 on Monticelli Drive for 1 year or until June 30th, 2024. This reinstatement and extension is based on the following findings of fact. The subdivision remains consistent with the comprehensive community plan. 2, the regulations are substantially the same as they were at the time of the original approval. 3, the zoning of the subdivision parcel is substantially the same as it was at the time of the original approval. 4, physical conditions on the subdivision parcel are substantially the same as they were at the time of the original approval. 5, any applicable state or federal regulations are substantially the same as they were at the time of the original approval. And 6, the required application fee is the same as it was at the time of the original approval, and the required fair share development fees are less than were required at the time of the original approval.
we have a motion from Paul. Do we have a second? Second. Second from Joe. Is there further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you, good luck. Our next agenda item is a major land development comprehensive permit pre-application concept plan for the village at Broad Rock. As planning board members are well aware, the pre-application stage of review is one for an exchange of information and ideas. It is informal in nature and is designed to help a project to move forward with as much input early on as possible. Is there anyone representing the applicant?
For the record, I'm Timothy Behan, professional engineer with Commonwealth Engineers in Providence, Rhode Island.
If he could repeat his name and affiliation, because the mic won't pick that up.
Timothy Behan, professional engineer, Commonwealth Engineers and Consultants in Providence, Rhode Island. We're here tonight for a major land development project. It's for a senior residential community. The property is situated off Broad Rock Road. It's Assessor's Plat 33, Lot 24, and it's 16 and a half acres in size. Can we show the existing conditions plan? Okay, this is the parcel. And if you look, Broad Rock Road is on the right hand of the sheet. And if you look on the far left is a jagged property line. That's wetlands over there and the Saugatucket River. There's a 200-foot setback buffer off of that river. Those are the dashed lines inside the property. And the second dashed line is a 20-foot structure setback. The existing site has an existing dwelling and a garage structure on it. So if we go to the proposed plan, we're looking at a concept with 30 single detached units. There'd be one access point off of Broad Rock Road. It would come into a loop area and several larger loops off of that loop-type cul-de-sac. There's 30 single-family detached units. We have a buffer around the entire complex, and it also had a community building near the cul-de-sac loop area. We're here tonight for pre-application so we're soliciting any types of comments going forward for the master plan, which would be the next submission.
Can you tell us a little bit about the design concept and how you integrated things such as good planning concepts and open space, the adjacent river, how these were integrated into the thought process that came up with this design?
It's a good question. The plan was actually designed by John Carter and Company. So I'm not sure where they are tonight, and why it caught me off guard here. I wasn't really going to do a presentation tonight, so I'm not sure where John is. So I can't really answer questions pertaining to his layout, but this is the layout in front of you. He's a registered landscape architect, and he has coordinated with the planning department and the client and came up with this arrangement.
Could you explain, may I, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Could you explain coordinate with the planning department?
Excuse me?
Could you explain coordinate with the planning department?
Mr. Carter did, yes. Is this John?
Yes, I think
Hey,
the team has just arrived.
we just got to the proposed plan, John, and they were asking about how you arrived at the layout.
And more specifically, how the layout was designed to integrate with the natural aspects of the site, the fact that it's adjacent to the Saugatucket River, and how it fits within good planning concepts in terms of the design. And I think your engineer is relieved that you have arrived, and hopefully you can answer some questions.
Well, thank you. I apologize for being late. So I don't know what Tim went over, so I'm just going to quickly go over so I can sort of stay on track, and I will get to your questions on that. So, and if this is redundant, I apologize. John Carter, I'm a registered landscape architect. Steve Clark, who's the applicant and his family owns the property, is here, and obviously Tim. The design is for 30 units, targeting the age 55 and over, and it's designed under to comply with the Senior Residential Community Ordinance that you have. It's allowed in this zone. It's an R40 zone, and it's allowed in this zone. It's required to have a minimum lot size of 30 acres. This lot's 16.5 acres, so the applicant will be requesting a variance from that requirement. I think it is important to keep in mind that there's a maximum density that's allowed, and that maximum density is 1.99 units per acre, and we are meeting the same density, actually slightly less, it's 1.96 units per acre. The only difference between this on the 16.5 acre lot and the same proposal on a 30-acre lot is there would be twice as many units, but there wouldn't be any more or less density. The site conditions, and I don't know what Tim touched on, but he can explain.
Nothing really, so just feel free to,
Okay, so I am going to rely on Tim after I'm done to explain in detail the site in terms of topography, soils, drainage. It's a pre-app, but, you know, the thoughts for drainage and septic treatment and that type of stuff. But the lot is located on the west side of Broad Rock Road. It extends and it slopes down towards the Saugatucket River, and it's about 1,300 average depth from the road back to the river. The easterly side, the easterly half of the site, that's the site closest to Broad Rock Road, is actually very heavily disturbed. There's a house there. There's remnants of farming. There's clearing. It's very thinly wooded. There's a lot of sort of farm-related structures, dilapidated chicken coops and those types of things. The other half of the site, the westerly half of the site, is also fairly thinly wooded. I don't have any historical knowledge of what went on there, but there's very small diameter trees. It doesn't look like it's a mature forest. It looks like it was farmed in some recent times, and it's predominantly covered with a mixture of oak and maple. I did walk the site. There's really nothing of any significance that I identified in terms of, you know, champion trees or anything like that. So as far as the design is concerned, we like to think that there's some positive qualities that this could bring. The ordinance is intended to provide housing alternatives or an alternative to people age 55 and older. And we're all aware of the need and shortage for housing. And in this case, these are smaller footprint buildings, so they'll be more affordable than the typical larger family homes that people would be leaving to move to downsize into these. The net result on that is that would open up other homes available for another group of people, primarily the younger people, families that are trying to find homes that aren't available. So we think that's a positive quality. The actual design, I don't know if my laser works on this thing. No. Somebody's got to invent one of them. The design is intended to promote more of a community, more interaction, and get away from between the residents, and get away from the single individual ownership with fenced-in private yards. And in order to do that, the buildings are clustered close together, which also resulted in a significant increase in open space beyond the required. And we've got the buildings, the back of the buildings, we're going to have decks and porches or patios that will all be fronting on shared common space. And so there'll be walkways and landscape features in those areas, and it'll be shared common space for people living there to use. In addition to that, and the fact that the ordinance requires what they call a senior service center. We've provided that. It's on the bottom of the little roundabout there, as required by the ordinance, but it would be more of a, community gathering center. I know that the word senior, when it's applied to 55 and older, is maybe a little, well, it's far in my rearview mirror, and I can still get around pretty good. So I think, we're talking about an active community. So there's a lot of open space. There's 200 feet of width from the river that's protected and will remain protected. There's 6 acres, which is about 36% of the site, that's proposed to remain in open space. And the requirement is for 10%, so it's 36% proposed and 10% required. And that came about as a result of clustering the buildings, and rather than spreading them out like a conventional subdivision. In addition to the total open space, there's a requirement for 50 feet of buffer, which is also open space, which is unmanaged vegetation along the property lines, and we've met and exceeded that on most of the site. And then, so the project's been designed to meet all the dimensional requirements, except, as I pointed out in the beginning, at 16.5 acres, there's a requirement for 30. The density is the same as proposed. The lot widths have been met. The building coverage allowable is 35%. We're only proposing 9.7% building coverage. The ordinance requires a 6,000 square foot land area for each unit, and we've met that. It's not delineated here, but it would be moving forward as a plan gets developed. We've met all the setbacks. We've met the perimeter buffer, and as I said, we've exceeded the total buffer requirement of minimum of 10% by 3 times. As far as the design, in addition to what we like to think of as more the sort of interaction between the people who would live there, and without getting into the engineering, we did take into consideration the topography. There's going to be a open drainage system that I'll let Tim explain. We tried to run the roads where we could, as many of them parallel to the contours, which helps with the drainage. We have the 2 main road, the main road coming in to the south and the loop road around at the top on the north that are running along the contours, but we've left space where we'll put some types of stormwater treatment. There is 200 feet of, in excess, but the buildings are in excess of 200 feet, but there's a 200-foot protected open space area directly adjacent to the river, and it won't be altered. It's currently wooded, sort of an open understory to it. It looks like it's used by maybe the tenants, I'm just speculating, but there's sort of 4-wheeler tracks through there. There's tree stands where people hunt and that type of thing. But most of those activities would not continue, and it would just continue to act as a buffer. So the overall design concept was really to create this place where people could go and not be isolated, but have it interactive, and also provide opportunities for people who are downsizing and open up their homes for people who are upsizing and looking for new homes. And that's sort of, at this point, the concept and the information I have, and I'll turn it back over to Tim. If you'd like, he can explain some of the more details.
Sure.
Once again, Tim Behan with Commonwealth Engineers, professional engineer. Engineering-wise, we're at the pre-application stage, so there's no engineering details on the plan shown. But as Mr. Carter mentioned, we're going to propose open natural grass swales for stormwater treatment and conveyance to downstream. Everything slopes from the road down to the river, so the swales would be sloped in that direction. At the downhill sides, we have a detention pond. There'd probably be another detention pond in the upper left corner as well. And for wastewater treatment, this is septic systems, so we need to go to DEM and get a septic permit. Other permits include a wetland permit with freshwater wetlands, and that may or will include a RIPDES permit for the soil erosion control of the project going forward.
So a couple of questions, and as you all know, this is, the pre-application stage is intended to be one of conversational in nature and discussion. What can you tell us about the soils on site, and more specifically, the topography and how it relates to the Saugatucket?
Yeah, the topography generally slopes from the Broad Rock Road to the river. So Broad Rock Road's the highest, the river's the lowest, and it flows in that direction. Soils, we've already done soils testing with DEM. We have verified groundwater tables at the site, and generally they're pretty good, 5 to generally 8 feet in depth, verified. And we have those soil evaluation forms as Category 5 soil, typically over Category 8, which is down deeper.
Okay, couple of other questions for either you or Mr. Carter. I'm not certain, looking at this plan, how this complies with what we generally perceive as the village model, other than there's a reference in the narrative to the actual size of the units. But to me, this doesn't look like a cluster. It just looks like units pretty much covering every portion of the site itself. You have two very small areas that you're calling open space that are, I guess the most polite way to put it is that they're linear in nature, but not much usable open space. And you have perimeter open space, which is also not terribly useful. You have this center section. I don't see on this plan where, and perhaps that hasn't yet been determined, where you're going to have a community septic system. Also concerned about the fact that this property does slope directly toward the river, so any runoff from impervious surfaces would be headed in that direction. So kind of just general, this doesn't seem to be a terribly creative plan and doesn't look like a cluster to me. And I think that, I'm not sure why you folks went with the comprehensive permit application as opposed to an ordinary application. So just some general thoughts that I have, and I'm sure other planning board
Some of
members.
those while I remember them.
Sure.
So the buildings are small in footprint relative to what could be done on a conventional subdivision. They're also 20 feet apart. So to suggest that, if the plan, and it's just a concept plan, doesn't make that clear, they're about as clustered that they could be. Actually, the ordinance requires a minimum 20 feet apart. They're set close to the road. There'll be architectural details on the building. There'll be porches and front stoops and that type of thing to try to create some more of a village and walkable community. You know, there'll be low traffic on the roads, so the roads would be able to be walked on. There'll be the sidewalks. The open space, I don't really understand what you're not seeing, or that I'm seeing and you're not seeing. It's actually quite a bit of open space. It's over a third of the lot. And when you say usable, you know, I guess I would ask what it is that you would see it being used for. It's very walkable. There could be trails with DEM's permission. There could be trails down to and along the river. But I think that the idea of having shared common space, shared not just open space, but common space, so not dividing it off into individual parcels, really does lend itself towards that sort of communal living that you're trying to get to. It does meet the ordinance with that one exception, in terms of, as I said, I won't go through them all again, but all the setbacks, perimeters, buffers, overall buffers, setbacks from the road. They're 25 feet from the road. That's about as close as you'd want to put them, 20 feet apart. So I think that what would bring this forward would be developing the landscape, developing the communal spaces, and developing the architecture of the buildings to speak to that. And it just hasn't, that's something that is considered in the design, but it's not developed at this stage.
Liz, you had,
Yeah, Maria mentioned the linear quality of the open space, and you had mentioned that it would, not only as it provide openness, but it encourages people to get to know each other, so to
To
speak.
interact.
If the backsides of the buildings have decks and porches, I mean, if the people in unit number 7 really like the people in unit number 12, then that's wonderful. They could have cookouts together, great. If the people in unit 7 don't like the people in unit 12, I'm just wondering if they're going to feel that their privacy is invaded. You don't have any separation if you want it. So then that raises the next question. So what happens if people want more privacy? They'll put up hedges, they'll put up fences. What happens to the open space in that situation? Because it's a possibility, right?
That could be regulated, so it would be dictated by whatever covenants are put on the property. I think that it's important to make a decision and define a vision going forward. And if you do want it to go forward as individual private spaces, it certainly could be done nicely. Or if you want it to be more of shared spaces, then it would be shared spaces. But it can't be both, and it needs to be defined. But it can be controlled, to answer your question, via covenants in the ownership.
go ahead, Paul.
So I guess when I think about this, I'm thinking about village or cottage development and sort of imagine, a central green with homes around that all facing each other, and that gets to Liz's question, where they still have some privacy in the back. I don't know that you could squeeze in the same number of units, but looking at it, thinking that you could eliminate that central road running north-south, have a common space in the middle, maybe even the community center, better than senior center, right? Somewhere in the middle where it's accessible to everyone, but just having, more of a, our front doors are facing each other, our back doors have a little privacy. I mean, it's small houses in a conventional subdivision is what this looks like.
We'll take everything into consideration. There are some sort of devices, design, I don't know why I use the word tricks, but that can be used to create, certain types of, not just visual, but sort of interactive experiences. To have, to look at the new urbanist handbook, which this is not an urban site, so it doesn't apply. if you looked at that and you said, okay, well, we've got these houses fronting on the space, the shared space, you still need to have vehicle access and so forth. So there's some scenarios you see where there's a major road that the houses front on, like in this case, and then there's rear access, and this is like to keep the cars and things from in front of the houses. That typically results in excessively more pavement and road, because now you have two roads doing what one road could do. So it's a matter of just prioritizing, but, you know, I think that Elizabeth's question sort of really got to the crux of it, which is we could decide, you know, how you want, we can design it a lot of different ways. Our thought was to make it more of a interactive and communal experience, but, you know, maybe by the time you're 55, you already got enough friends, and you don't want anybody, you just come home and nobody talk to you. I don't know. But that's sort of something that the architecture and the site architecture can.
Just to clarify, I wasn't thinking about adding more roads. I was thinking that where these houses face each other across a green space, there would be some sidewalks, maybe space for a community garden, but not necessarily roads in front of the house. You know, more of a just,
But then you would have the back of the road facing, the back of the house facing the road, or have two fronts. I'm not being facetious. You can
No,
have
I know.
two fronts. You can have a front on the road and a garage door and that type of thing in the
or a
back.
common parking area.
What's that?
Yeah.
Common parking area rather than individual parking at every,
Oh, and then walking to your,
yeah.
so people want garages.
Well, there is a tremendous amount of roadway on this project. And I think the reason that it's difficult to envision a cluster concept is because there are so many units that you can't see how any clusters would be able to be tucked into areas of the project. Certainly, a project such as this in this location should highlight the fact that you have this natural resource adjacent to it and should be designed to both enhance and protect that natural resource. And I know that you mentioned Congress for New Urbanism. Our Director of Planning has a considerable amount of experience with regard to that, and thinking that he might have a couple of comments with regard to the design as well to help us out.
Yep, thank you, Maria. And again, I applaud Mr. Carter's initial efforts to try and maybe check some of the boxes, and he referred to new urbanism. I think first, the regulations are drawn out and require 30 acres, because on 30 acres, it gives you great design flexibility to initiate some of those new urbanistic styles of development. When you cut that acreage, in essence, in half, even though it may be the same density, you have a parcel that's half as big as it was intended to be to give you that flexibility to initiate some of those principles. So I appreciate the comment from Paul Jordan that this looks like a conventional subdivision with smaller homes on it. I think it's also difficult, and Mr. Carter referenced this evening, that here's a design that the planning board is asked to react to. We haven't done any stormwater really work on this because we're relying on swales. Well, if you're relying on roadside swales that need to fit a roadside swale, a street tree, and houses that are 20 feet off that road, I'm not sure how you accommodate all of that. Do you have pipes under the driveway, or does the driveway go down 12 inches and back up to a garage? So there are some space constraints there. New urbanism principles associated with the Congress of New Urbanism in a cluster-type development, or more formally a cottage-type development, would have a very different take on the terminology of utilized common space or open space and the interaction between the residents in that space. And in most aspects, to Liz's point, there's typically in these types of development very definitive, defined private space, then there's quasi-private space, and then there's public space. So you give each landowner that private space that's enjoyed by them, that's somewhat isolated from a common shared space that is different than the shared open space. And with only 60 to 80 feet between the units, it's difficult to do that. Again, I'd go back to Mr. Jordan's comment. My initial take on this is similar to Mr. Jordan's. This is a conventional subdivision that utilizes every topographical, soil-conditioned area for development. I'd ask Mr. Carter, why didn't you go within 200 feet of the brook? That's where the topography drops off, and it drops at about 12 to 15% back to the river. So you've put the development where it's most accessible and most easily developed, and you've stayed away from maybe more environmentally challenged areas or topographically challenged area. Again, 12 to 15% doesn't necessarily make you shy away from putting homes on a 10 to 12, 15% slope. But again, the regulations laid this out to occur in a 30-acre parcel to give you more design flexibility. And I think you could get that same design flexibility with potentially a smaller unit yield. You could also eliminate the need for some of the road systems. But I think there are some decent bones here. But to get that unit yield of 30, I think you're compromising the very principles you're trying to adhere to.
I just would like to point out that by doing, and this site is the size it is, so we can't change that. A 30-acre site would have the same density.
I don't know that.
Well,
The regulations allow you that density. I don't know if the design would.
okay,
allow
but just if you let me finish, based on, I'm just responding to what you said, and I'm saying that if we had come in and the site was 25 acres, 30 acres, we would have taken the same design requirements and applied them. So you would have the same density, you would have the same percentage of common space as is now if this was doubled. The space, the ordinance does not allow the open space to be, have structures on it. So I believe, so the open space between the buildings, the common space I'll call it, isn't really open space. Open space is the buffers and so forth. So I understand what you're saying, but I'm just presenting it from our point of view that if we weren't here with this, if we didn't have this discussion and the lot was larger, we would have scaled the development to meet what's allowable under the regulations, because the regulations were designed to already take into account environmental protections and minimizing impacts. That's why the regulations are there. So we typically don't start with that and then say, well, we're going to further limit.
The difficulties I have is when you say you're trying to adhere to the urbanistic principles and then you do a conventional subdivision, it's hard for me as a professional to take that as credible.
To what you said to meet the what?
You said you have designed this, instituting the new urbanist type.
No,
development.
I said a couple of the elements of that. This is not a site for new urbanism. It's not urban. That's misused all the time. New urbanism came about in order to develop urban sites, to redevelop urban sites. And the elements of urban living don't apply to Broad Rock Road.
I disagree with you. I think new urbanist principles have to do with setback, with the different types of spaces, public, private, quasi-public, and so on. So it's a design concept that can be utilized in different situations. And I think Jamie's right. The fact that you are asking for double the density is what is not allowing you to have something that is considered a good design. I mean, it does look like someone just took postage stamps and put them all over the site.
Well, there was a lot more that went into it, and it's not, I'll say it again, it's not double the density. It's the same density.
May I ask a
Want to
question?
hear what we have to say? Go ahead, Paul.
So you said you're trying to design this within the regulations, but the regulations say that you need a 30-acre site.
Correct,
This is not.
correct.
And so it seems like there needs to be some give and take on what we're going to end up with here, because it's not a 30-acre site. You want a variance to get there. So I think what we're all thinking is go back to the drawing board, and probably you're going to have to go back with fewer units to make it work.
We will go back to the drawing board, and we'll try to take what you heard. I'm not a proponent, just so you know, of the New Urbanism cookbook, because when you drive through those neighborhoods, it's a very formulaic way to design, and everything from window sashes to soffits and proportions of gables and so forth is all available to the builder in a checklist. And when you drive through those neighborhoods, and there are some around, at least I can see that, and it takes away from, in my opinion, creativity, individuality, and so forth. Now, with that said, there are some elements that I do like, and I think we've tried to address, and a lot of that has to do with creating more community and less just, because this could just be a conventional subdivision with 40,000 square foot lots and houses in it. It would be probably more pavement. In fact, there's a yield plan in the submission that shows that.
Just one other quick question. Are there additional designs? I mean, are they all going to look like this house, or is there a whole?
I'm going to let Steve Clark talk about that and the other issue with the,
I think,
with the comp permit.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
I think that's important.
My name is Stephen Clark. I'm a licensed professional engineer in Rhode Island, although in this particular case, it's family's farm that I am just overseeing the development on. A couple of quick questions. First of all, we never filed, I just want to clear it up, as a comprehensive permit. We just filed as a straight application, okay? It was put on,
That's good news.
because our only thinking was we only needed a variance of the 30 acres down to 15 acres. That's number one. Number two is, our proposal is for 30 units, 25 market rate units, and 5 affordable units, so that our density of market rate units is somewhere in that 1.8 range units per acre, not the 1.99 allowed for by the zoning ordinance. And then, I got to be honest with you, I forgot what the question was.
just about the cottage design.
Oh, yes, that is a concept plan for one unit. We were planning on 3 different facades with different colors. We didn't want one color building on one building up. It would be different, a variety of buildings. The other thing that I have to mention is the problem that we face in trying to do this is just the cost of road structure. We can go back and eliminate some road and some units, but it gets a point of feasibility. Because if I'm looking at a site now that I really only have 25 market rate units on, and my infrastructure is not going to change, and the infrastructure cost is quite expensive per over 55 residential unit you get back in return for that structure. So, like, I realize in an ideal world that we can turn around and say, oh, 20 units would look good here. But at 20 units, I'm better off going to conventional subdivision. And so that's the problem that we have, It comes down to finances, and you've probably heard this before. I'm not probably the first one to say it. And so that was our reasoning when we looked at this. We've been in a couple of times to the planning office, and they gave us some good ideas, and we went back and forth on it. But our thinking was that we bring 30 over 55 houses into the marketplace that would hopefully open up 30 workforce homes. It was even, anybody read the Boston Globe yesterday? The highlights in the Boston Globe was the Rhode Island housing market. And Rhode Island has a serious housing problem, not only price-wise, but numbers. And so we just thought that this plan of 25 market rate, 5 affordable, would open up other units into the marketplace. Yes?
I have a
Hi.
couple of questions. So it says in your narrative that some portion of your structures will be duplexes?
We were proposing duplexes at one point. We could, if the planning board felt that duplexes may be appropriate, a mixture of duplexes and single-family homes, single standalones. But I'm sorry that it was still in the narrative. But at this point, we're proposing here all standalone structures. We could put duplexes in there and maybe open up a little bit, because by your zoning ordinance, we have to keep 20 feet away from each building, and that's what spreads them out.
So following up on Mr. Jordan's question, are all the houses intended to look like your sketch, but different colors, or are they all designed differently?
There'll be different facades, so that, in other words, there'll be, they won't all be individually designed. There'll probably be about 2 or 3 different shape models in the front facade, and then with a variety of colors
Okay.
available.
And then my last question, so I'm not sure if you're aware, but our planning board has worked pretty hard for the last couple of years, coming up and working with Jamie Rabbit to come up with some really good design ideas for cottage-style development. I'm your demographic. My kids just went off to college. My husband wants to downsize. I am your demographic for this
Right.
project. I would prefer, if I looked at my options for me, to have a cottage-style development where I can barbecue with my neighbors, but have a private backyard, set up around a central courtyard, and I would pay more, much more, for that setup than this, to me, is a conventional subdivision. It looks like every other subdivision in town. And whether it has a sidewalk running by the backyards, it's still the same subdivision that we have all over town, which may not appeal to someone who's now an empty nester and trying to find a community, because aside from the sidewalk that runs through the backyard, there really is no central gathering space. I think that your senior center, oh gosh, let's call it something better than that, somewhere in the middle with a horseshoe pit and a volleyball net and a barbecue pit and a cocktail bar would be so much more fun to me than, than the mail room on the side. And so for me, I would prefer that if you would be willing to maybe sit down with Jamie and talk with him about the hard work we've done on some cottage design, because I think you might find that that's a more appealing project, both for us to review, but also for your demographic.
You're right, except studies find now that what the over 55 wants is a first floor master and open living space and a 2-car garage. And so that takes a lot away from the cottage type feeling. And I actually live in an over 55 place in North Kingston, and we have an open area, and it's used once a year for our annual meeting. We have it outside. Other than that, nobody uses it.
But is it set up in a cottage style?
No.
All of our backyards abut and there's a barbecue pit out there? Or is it set up more
No.
subdivision style where everyone has their own driveway, their own front door, and they're more isolated from one another than they might be in a cottage
Well,
community?
it's probably like 50-50. Some do abut others.
And I'm not going to also argue with your reasoning, but the house next door to me just sold this weekend to a couple from Massachusetts who's retiring to South County. So I don't know that the logic holds that your purchasers will be vacating 30 family houses in town I'm not sure that that necessarily,
You mean strictly in town?
yeah, that you can get from A
Oh,
to B,
that-
that these
yeah.
30 houses will be vacating 30 other houses in town and opening up either workforce housing or family housing in town. I think that we're becoming very attractive to retirees looking for,
Well, if not in town, the concept of opening up workforce housing is what you're hoping to gain. Like, they may not be coming from South Kingston to here, but elsewhere.
Madam Chair, if I may?
Yes.
Could you please explain workforce housing to me?
Workforce housing is,
And how this relates to your development?
workforce housing is what our goals are here, is to bring an over 55 couple who's now empty nesters, who have a 3-4 bedroom home, either locally or in Rhode Island area, hopefully, that would sell their home to downsize and to move into this type of unit. The home that they're leaving would then be opened up.
So the home they're leaving would be the workforce housing?
Right.
And how are you going to control the price on that sale unit?
Oh, that's, the market's going to
So
control
just
that.
so the planning board understands, workforce housing is a terminology that is misunderstood. Workforce housing is a category within the terminology of affordable housing. Its terminology is housing for the workforce within the community, such as your teachers, your police, your fire, and your essential kind of town employees. It is not for the people who work at Shaw's. It's not for the people who work at your restaurants. It's a social class within a community. And you can only provide for that if it's deed restricted. To stand before you and say, someone's gonna sell their unit that they bought in 1980 for $400,000, that is going on the market for $800,000 now, is gonna go into the workforce housing category within this community, is wrong in my professional opinion.
There
So
is,
that's why I asked you to explain it. If you're trying to provide workforce housing here within this community, explain to me how they're deed restricted. And I'm getting conflicting messages. Your design landscape architect, and I really respect Mr. Carter, talked about design principles associated with new urbanism, and that sometimes they can become, we'll use the term cookie cutter, because they're too provincial about what they have. And you referenced individuality. Yet you testified that you're gonna have 3 types of housing. So that means there's 10 duplicated houses within here. And I would ask another question. What architect designed that rendering that you showed, or is that just from the internet?
I did it.
So that's your house design?
That is my house concept.
You designed that?
Did I design it? Yes.
Okay. Do you have other elevations for that, showing the backside that would adhere to some of the design
On that
principles you taught?
pre-application, no.
So again, to my comment earlier, they're asking the planning board, and I think you're doing a really good job, and hopefully, and I know Mr. Carter appreciates it, trying to articulate some of your concerns, but you're short on a lot of things. You're short on how the drainage works, how the property's landscaped, what the public and private space actually looks like, what the final footprints for the homes are. I'm looking at a development that shows 1-car garages, but you said you want 2-car garages. So to me, this is a very, very early preliminary plan. And I saw one of your early preliminary plans that was drawn by you, and I talked about all of the design principles that the planning board has been working towards and were alluded to tonight, and this is the result of that conversation. So I think what I'm hearing from the planning board is enforcement or reinforcement of the design principles we discussed in my office that resulted in this plan that don't articulate that conversation or some of the goals and objectives that the planning board has. And I understand this is pre-application, it's an early phase, but you're trying to get feedback from the planning board as well as staff, and I think we're we're trying to articulate to that. And it's not intended to find fault with your applicant. From my perspective, it's trying to give you positive feedback so you can make or contemplate making revisions that are more intuitive to what the planning board and you can agree on.
Thanks, Jamie. Other comments? Robin?
Sure. I'd like to step back a minute because we're talking about a large variance, and we haven't talked at all about whether our community needs this 55 or older community. We have a few. I would like to know what the occupancy rate is of that. How many of those people, because I think I read twice in the letter that we were going to retain our brightest and our best, and I don't see how that equates. And I suspect that a lot of the people that move into our senior communities don't come from here at all. We're not allowing them to remain living where they've lived and paid taxes. These are strangers coming in and going to fill our space and cost us more in terms of infrastructure. So we're considering a variance where maybe we don't even need or want any more senior communities presently. So I would like some more statistics on how full are they, where do they come from, how is it really benefiting, how is it meeting our comprehensive plan to benefit our community, how is it retaining our best and our brightest? Besides talking about what these houses are going to look like, let's take a big step back and say, why this?
So to add to what Robin said, this board is open to housing types of various styles that are not necessarily limited to one age group or another. We very much understand the housing crisis. However, we don't think that the fact that it exists and that the real estate market is so expensive that necessarily justifies poor design. We believe that in a site such as this, which is not in a central portion of any of our villages, something can be designed that's attractive to whatever market you choose to pursue. But again, I think there's so much potential for utilization of this site. I mean, think about the view shed, think about where you have the area that's adjacent to the buffer zone, and you have your stormwater facility, 3 houses, and then a very long roadway. So, it just makes sense to try to get the roadway not only reduced, but away from the buffer zone to the river, and try to both protect and enhance something that's very special that folks that might move to this neighborhood would appreciate. So, again, just some feedback. Paul?
I'm biting my tongue till it bleeds here. I think conversations about people from elsewhere moving into our community make me really queasy. I'm sure that there's a need for this kind of housing. I'm not crazy about this design, but the idea that other people outside of South Kingstown shouldn't move here and change our
I don't
community.
think that was my point. The point was why increase the density to such a gross amount?
Well, that's not what you said. But I'll just leave it there.
I think I was putting it in context of our comprehensive plan is supposed to help our community.
But our community is larger than just South Kingstown. I mean, I'll just leave it there.
I think the 55 and older might be a point of confusion because of the requirement for so many acres versus this project, which may not have that acreage, and therefore, as Jamie said, the design is limited. And I don't think the board is particular about whatever demographic you want to market your project to. We're more interested in good design overall. Joe, did you have something?
Yeah, this is a pre-application and meant to be exchange of ideas, so I just want to give you some thoughts and maybe some considerations for the LMI component. So this is not a comprehensive permit.
That's correct.
Joe, can you use the mic? Thanks.
if it was a comprehensive permit, the requirements would be 25% on the LMI, which would be about 8 units, and you're proposing 5. When we review a comprehensive permit, what we're really doing is we're trying to draw that balance between the variances and the impacts to the community versus what the community is receiving in the way of affordable housing. And that's the balance we're trying to get. In this case, you're potentially looking for a variance, but you're only offering the absolute minimum of the subdivision. So I know I personally, when it's only the absolute minimum, there's no give and take there. I personally would have a hard time endorsing that variance. My other concern about that would be whether we're actually reaching the audience or the need in South Kingstown. Typically, the LMI units, there's a need for 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom rental units, affordable purchasing. In this particular, I assume these are 2-bedroom?
Yes, that's
bedrooms.
correct.
So I'm a little concerned whether we really have that particular need, or even if we have people that will purchase those, whether it's really the people that need affordable housing. So typically, new professionals, and for the over 55, I'm afraid that we may be reaching an audience that doesn't really need it, right? Maybe they have the assets but don't really have the income, so they qualify, but in reality, they don't necessarily need this. What I would like to see you going forward is perhaps maybe working with Brian, who's sitting over here in the corner, who runs the affordable housing, and look for creative options on that LMI component. Maybe something that meets the community's need a little bit more, maybe something that gives the town more than the absolute minimum, and then in exchange, maybe some design that doesn't drive your price so much. So maybe for that LMI component, I would like you to maybe work with the staff, work with the Affordable Housing Commission, look at how we could have more than the absolute minimum if you're asking for a variance, and at the same time, come up with a design that doesn't necessarily drive your expenses as much as it would for, a full comprehensive permit. So, but just coming in for a variance with the absolute minimum LMI, there's no give and take there for the town, right? I don't see a give and take for the town. I see just a take. So I'd like to see you working with staff and coming up with some creative options that will better the town as well as yourself. So.
Thanks, Joe. Anyone else? And I know that either you or perhaps your engineer or John mentioned duplexes. If somebody could come up with a really good design for duplexes, I think they would win an award, because we have not seen very many, not just in South Kingstown, but across the state, that really are great designs in terms of duplexes. They all seem to look the same, they don't function well, they're not well integrated into, a project as a whole.
And that's my thought, maybe working with Brian, working with the affordable housing, maybe you have the LMI component says duplexes, and then you end up with more LMI units, and they have some 1-bedrooms that maybe serves that demographic that needs LMI housing a little bit better. So just some creative thought and brainstorming and working with staff for that piece.
Anything else? Any other thoughts from staff? Thanks. We look forward to a future collaboration.
Yep, Madam Chair, just as follow-up, staff is here to serve both the applicant as well as the planning board and the residents of this community. We are more than willing to sit down with the development team and have a conversation and continue that conversation.
Thank you. Sure. We have someone in the audience who wishes to speak. This is pre-application. It's very informal. State your name for the record.
Hi, my name is Elise Torello. I'm Secretary of Friends of the Saugatucket, and I understand that it's pre-app, and this is very informal, but if we're trying to get all ideas out there as early as possible, I don't see a downside into letting us speak, so I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. Friends of the Saugatucket is a 501c3 nonprofit organization based here in town. Our mission is to promote and enhance the natural and cultural features of the Saugatucket River and its watershed for the benefit of the river and its surrounding lands and communities. We are the officially designated watershed council advocating for the Saugatucket River and its watershed. We're designated by the Rhode Island Rivers Council, so we have legal standing to weigh in on any development project affecting the Saugatucket. As you saw in the plans, the western boundary of this parcel is completely outlined by the Saugatucket River and its jurisdictional wetland from DEM. And we have major concerns. There's over 1,700 linear feet of the Saugatucket River. That is the western border of this parcel. We're very concerned for a number of reasons. Major wetland portion of this parcel borders the Saugatucket. It's very environmentally sensitive, and it deserves to be treated that way. The zoning at this site is R40, 1 acre zoning. The yield plan showed 13 units with a very strange road layout. The applicants are looking to double this. There is a reason why we have zoning ordinances in this town. This site is outside of the urban services boundary. It's outside of the future sewer service area. You're looking at bringing in municipal water from another watershed and putting into septic systems, community septic system, individual septic systems, not even sure which, as it's not indicated on the plan. I know it's early in the process. But one way or another, the way this is proposed, you're looking at 60 bedrooms worth of septic system being on this site, taking water from another watershed and dumping it right here on this site next to a river. That's very concerning. Where's all the stormwater going to go? I mean, I know this, again, is early days, and I went through the town's comprehensive plan, and this is not the site in this town during that long, arduous, comprehensive community planning process. We talked about infill, we talked about village development, we talked about urban services boundaries, we talked about where do we want the development to happen in town. This is not where it was supposed to happen. We need to take that. Why do we have a comprehensive community plan and zoning ordinances if we're not going to develop following that guidance? I'm going to try not to be too long-winded here. The stormwater, I looked at the one-bedroom or one-car garages on these cottages with small driveways in front. I didn't see any additional parking on site. I don't know where the grandkids and the aunties and uncles are supposed to park at birthdays and Thanksgiving, but when you start adding in parking for all of those people visiting all of those units on holidays, you're talking about an awful lot of impervious surface. Where's all that going to go? On this sloped lot right towards the river? We have major concerns. I don't know where the snow is going to be pushed, containing all the chemicals from the roads. That's not on this plan. You need to consider where all of this stormwater runoff is going to go. And that one small spot behind those 3 units, tucked into the southwest corner of the lot, right between those units and the river, can't see how that's going to work. There's so many reasons that this is the wrong proposal for this site, and I know it's early days. I'm not going to go into all of them, and I understand that this parcel is zoned 1 acre. We're not saying that this parcel shouldn't be developed, but there's a reason why this is zoned 1 acre, and we don't think that doubling the density in this site is a wise thing to do from an ecological perspective.
Thanks, Lise.
Hi, David Gregg, 751 Saugatucket Road. I'm the abutter but one on the same side of the river. I'm separated from this parcel by, I don't know, 100 feet or so. And I just wanted to straighten out a couple of things just by way of information. as you know, when you half the size of an area, the perimeter goes down linearly, but the area goes down by the square. You could keep dividing this in half and a half and a half, and doesn't mean you can still fit a certain number of houses per square foot. So that argument I have somewhat of an issue with. The other thing is that this land used to be pasture that was attached to my farm, and that's why it doesn't have big trees. It's part of the agricultural heritage of our town. So I'm not against developing this parcel. As the way I see it, the impacts on the environment here, Saugatucket River is still a cold water stream. It still has a native brook trout population, which is very rare in the state. We're working hard to conserve it elsewhere in the state. The impacts to that resource, just as an example, from a development like this would be septage, lawn chemicals, and outdoor lighting. Those are the three that come to mind. There's no indication at all on here of how the septage would be handled. And while I understand this is a preliminary study, there's sort of a tendency for these things to creep as you add one thing and another thing. I can't remember whether it was the engineer or somebody else who said, oh yeah, there are sidewalks, or mentioned that people will be walking around on sidewalks. There aren't any sidewalks shown on this plan, so you add those. The other thing is that those linear open spaces between the ranges of houses were also described as part of the stormwater mitigation plan, as well as the place where people would, I don't know, chat with their neighbors over the backyard. So there's sort of a square footage double dipping going on here, and I just think that you have to be really careful going into this that the missing components, which we say right now, well, it's preliminary, we'll fit them in there somewhere. Eventually, they're gonna run away with the project. Honestly, if this were on a sewer, it would take away a lot of the negative impacts of practically anything you built there. But this is beyond the urban service boundary because this is not where we decided to put sewage. And I think the applicant himself said, this is not an urban part of town. It's not an urban part of town because it's beyond the urban service boundary. And a development like this that pretty much requires sewage is not supposed to be beyond the urban service boundary. It's a high water table. Anybody who lives along the west side of Broad Rock or the east side of Broad Rock knows that that's a really high water table. There's no provision here for stormwater or septage. And those are the comments that I have had reviewing this so far. Thank you very much for your attention.
Is there anyone else who wishes to speak? All right, let's continue on. Our next agenda item is a public informational meeting, conceptual master plan review, major land development project, South County Commons, District 5 Apartments.
Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board, Attorney Matthew Landry on behalf of the applicant Suffolk Realty. Excuse me. As you may recall, we appeared before you on our master plan application in January, and there have been a few developments since that time. I have been in regular conversations with Mr. Squires in his office with regard to some notice issues and procedural issues that have come up since that January meeting. And as a way of updating the board on some of those issues, I thought it was pertinent to appear before you this evening and explain what some of those discussions have been. Council and I have agreed that the board really hasn't had a chance to even hear really what's been going on in the applicant's position or any opposition there may be. I do think there's a notice issue for this evening, so I don't want to put anything substantive in the record. It came to our attention that this application has not been advertised as a comprehensive permit. You may see on the agenda that that item that just concluded before us was advertised as a comp permit. I know it was pre-app. We had been advertised as a comp permit previously. I flagged this issue in January for the original butter notifications and corrected them to mention and indicate that it was a comprehensive permit, so I don't think there's any issue in that regard. But a couple of other notice issues came up after the initial January meeting. In February, it came to our attention, I think the day before the meeting, that the agenda that was posted to the Secretary of State's website had the incorrect time. I think it was 10 a.m., so there was clearly a notice issue. And because of that, we extended the decision deadline from, I believe it was earlier, mid-March, to the end of April. I don't have the date exactly on me, but it was extended to allow sufficient time to have the March hearing. About a week before the March hearing, we received a memo from staff, Mr. Rabbitt's office, raising a number of procedural issues as it relates to the South County Commons Master Plan, as well as some other miscellaneous issues with the application. Out of an abundance of caution, because it was only a week before the meeting, we wanted to obviously allow sufficient time to address those procedural issues if needed, and whether or not a new notice was needed as a result of that inquiry. So we extended the deadline again through May 1st or 2nd, I believe, for purposes of this meeting, and we were prepared to conclude our testimony, but because it's not advertised as a comp permit, we were afraid to proceed once again, and my client was a bit hesitant to extend the deadline any further for obvious reasons. But with that being said, I want to backtrack a little bit and just mention what those procedural issues are. We thought we had addressed a number of these during the course of the initial hearing and even some of the TRC meetings that we had, but as I understand it, staff and I believe council's of the position that the 1998 South County Commons Master Plan needs to be amended. And the reason for that is in the process of discussing density and yield plans and some correspondence between Eric Prevey from Dupree and my office, there was a plan that was submitted from the 98 approvals that show a purported use restriction on residential and says that this property or this district was approved for light industrial and light commercial or commercial uses, not residential. Now, we have a difference of opinion as to whether or not that's a plat restriction, how you go about amending it if needed, and the procedure to go about that. So that's sort of what we've been trying to figure out. The second issue that I believe came up was the existing hotel plan, both the preliminary and final plan, as you know, shows the hotel and 2 restaurant pad sites for this property and the associated parking. And I believe some members of this board have raised the question of how can you modify parking when you have a plan on record. And we don't disagree with that. We know the preliminary plan will need to be amended at some point in the future, but we cannot amend a preliminary plan until we have a proper master plan in place. So we don't necessarily disagree that a new master plan was needed to address the 98 master plan. And that's what we submitted to you. And it's really always been our position that the new master plan application would supersede and control the uses for this property to the effect that it amends or supersedes that 98 master plan and any purported use restrictions it would have. That's the mechanism that you can use. In our practice, we don't really ever say an amended master plan. We say new master plan, and we submit the new plan. So that essentially is what we were trying to do to address it. You may recall that the Fairfield Inn went straight to preliminary because we had the existing master plan, we were vested in it, and we presented straight to preliminary. We would have done the same here if we didn't have this issue with the master plan. So I don't think we're that far off on that issue. It's really a matter of procedurally how you go about that. And I'll just say, recently, even in January, I had a similar issue in Westerly on a comp permit for 100% affordable. There was an existing mixed-use master plan approved for the property. We went in with a combined master preliminary plan, new plan, that effectively got approved and amended what was on record already. So it's not uncommon there have been a number of instances within South County Commons that included new master plans and amendments for uses throughout the commons. So procedurally, because out of an abundance of caution, I think this meeting should be renoticed to address it as a comprehensive permit. My client would certainly be amenable to extending the deadline to the next public hearing of this board. I believe it's the 23rd, if that's correct, so 24th, whatever that Tuesday is. Wouldn't have an objection to that. I would kindly ask that council and I review the notice or newspaper advertisement just to make sure it includes all the language we need to include. I'm not sure who the town uses regularly, but I understand that the Independent has a Thursday deadline. That would be this Thursday to advertise starting next week. So I just want to make sure we get our ducks in a row. And out of an abundance of caution, even though I don't think it's necessary, I would include a request to amend the 98 master plan to the extent that's deemed necessary. That be included in the notice, and we would renotice the abutters in accordance with that, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. I don't really have anything additional or substantive to add to that. I just was asked to come in, and I wanted to make sure the board understood what the reason for the continuances were, and why we're here and why we're trying to address this. I do think that, again, out of an abundance of caution, we should renotice this. I think the next scheduled meeting would allow ample time to re-advertise, renotice it, and come back and conclude our testimony.
Thank you. It does sound like you are trying to go about this in a well-thought-out manner. Obviously, it would be easiest for the board if all of these issues were cleared up and clarified prior to having our public informational meeting. I am concerned about the fact that given the date, 23rd or 24th, this board would only have one meeting in which to have the public hearing, close it, and make the decision. It would really be better to allow the board to hold the public hearing, get the input from staff, have our usual in-depth conversation that we have, and then move forward with whatever we think is appropriate in terms of a decision after that. I mean, as you know, we do not like to write motions at our meetings. We want them to be thoroughly vetted by staff and legal counsel. I also seem to recall that it must have been the January meeting, you were not able to provide us with the traffic engineer, so that would be something I would assume you would have available.
We do expect that, yes.
Okay.
As well as a land use expert as well.
Okay. And of course, I think it's worth continuing your conversation with legal counsel and staff with regard to whether it's superseding a requirement of a previously approved plan or whatever is the most appropriate mechanism. Peter?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I figured I'd just jump in and let the board know what the issues are,
Sure.
at least as I see them. I think we agree that there are some issues that need to be addressed. We may disagree about the appropriate way to address them.
It's always the way, right?
Right. So the major issue I think that Matt spotted, Mr. Landry spotted, was, or discussed with you, is the 98 master plan, which is the overall master plan for South County Commons. That was a phased master plan, which allowed the master plan approval to be in place, and then over a longer period of time, it allowed applicants to come in with preliminary plans that were consistent with that master plan. And it separated the different phases into districts. This is District 5. So one issue with that master plan is that there's a note on the plan that says use limitation, District 5, no residential, and no retail. So that's a concern. We were discussing how can you address that. I think it would require an amendment to that original master plan. I think you could do it through the comp permit process, since the planning board does have that one-stop shopping ability when you're addressing a comp
I
permit.
hate that term, you need to find something else.
It allows you.
Sounds like we're a grocery store, but,
It allows you it allows you to sit as any local body that.
Yes.
Any relief that the town can grant, the board can grant. But the question is, how do you perfect an application for that? And my review up to this point has, my conclusion, at least to this point, has been, you need to make an application with the owners in the plat as it consists now to release the restriction, and then the notice area would be the entire plat. The abutted radius would be measured from the entire plat. The reason I formed that opinion, and I think Mr. Landry would disagree with this, but this is what we were discussing, and I wanted to let the board know. So there's two aspects to that. The first is the board's consideration. When the board approved the master plan in '98, it was looking at the entire project. You approved certain aspects, but you did it on a condition of placing limits on other aspects. The other issue, though, is that when the plan was approved and lots are sold within that plan, the people buying property within the plan buy it. That condition comes with it. They're buying that condition. So that's a real tricky issue. That's a real tricky issue. And that's why, up to this point, what I've discussed with Matt, and I know there's a counsel for the abutters, I've also let them know that this is where I was thinking on this, is that really, I think you can address it through the comp permit process, but it's more complicated because you need to make sure that you have the right applicants and you have the right abutters notice area in your application. So I think that's a really tricky issue. Then another issue was raised by the condominiums attorney next door, which is the access is currently going through an easement through the condominium attorney's, the condominium's property. And that came about in the early 2000s. Through the approval process for the condominium, there was a condition that required them to allow access through their property to this property, District 5 of South County Commons. So then a question comes up of, at least was raised by, I'll let them speak for themselves, I just want to get it all out there. Does that give them a vested right in this as well? Because in that condition, that limited District 5 to commercial uses, because the planning board imposed a condition on them to give access when that condition on the use, restricting the use was in place. I'm not really sure how it would come out on that, being candid. I'd have to dig into that a little bit more to figure out whether or not they would have a say based on this unique history. But all that being said, there are a lot of issues that I think we need to hammer out. I think it would be good for everybody involved to sit down with counsel for all the interested parties and see if they can come up with an agreed upon way to address it. But short of that, I think it would, just to echo your point, Madam Chair, it makes sense to give it enough time to make sure that we're teeing this up correctly. To be fair to the applicant and to be fair to the abutters and everybody else.
yes, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I do have, I understand the complicated nature of all these things and the degree or potential lack thereof of certainty that might be considered by someone purchasing property within this district as a whole. Susan?
I'm sorry, can I just understand, if a person in the special management district purchased a piece of land with that restriction and has had to abide by that restriction all these years, are we opening ourselves up to liability or litigation for someone who's not potentially been able to use their land as they would have wished if they could have changed the rules too? Do you know what I'm saying?
I think I see the point. I don't think we would have liability so long as the request is coming from the current owners of the plan, the entire plan. Because at this point, the restriction is owned by the current owners in the plan. The prior owners in the plan, they were subject to the restriction. If they could have gathered up all the plan owners and come in and asked for the restriction to be waived, they had that opportunity if they wanted to. I think you could get into a problem if there's a current owner that says, you know, for instance, this is right next door to the Bradley School. If they were to say, hey, we own property in this plan, and this plan has this restriction, we're an owner in this plan, we own this restriction, then there could be a problem. If the applicant can sit down and kind of broaden the scope of the people that are willing to sign off on an amendment to the overall plan, then you could resolve that issue. But, you know, I don't know what the applicant could do that or if they've had discussions on that. So it is tricky.
So
Jamie?
if I can just expand on that, Susan, I think the answer right for the moment, given that it's 8:35 on a Tuesday, that we don't have a definitive answer. I'm not sure the applicants can point to particular case law that gives him a definitive stance, nor can the town stand and relate to case law and give a definitive stance. We have identified throughout the process a number of issues, including early on at the TRC, about the need to amend a previously approved master plan. So this isn't something new. It was out in 2022. The application came in, and at the initial meeting in January that's been referenced tonight, that the applicant didn't have 4 of his planning consultants with him that evening. So their intent in January was to continue it to February. Unfortunately, we did have a legal notice issue on the February meeting. On March, there was correspondence that went back and forth between our department, our legal counsel, as well as the applicant's legal counsel, that it was not our suggestion to delay public testimony that evening. That was a choice of the applicant to not move forward in March with any public testimony, and erring on the side of caution on Mr. Landry's part so that he could keep the record as straight as possible. With regards to the meeting this evening, again, it was the applicant's choice not to submit testimony this evening. With regards to the notice aspect, I want to just touch upon 2 items associated with that. First, there's the notice on your agenda. Rhode Island law doesn't treat a comprehensive permit from an agenda standpoint any differently than any other application in our view. And again, we're looking at this as a department. The law specifically states that you treat it identical to the category that it would normally be in. So if it's a subdivision, you advertise it as a subdivision. If it's a subdivision that requires major land development review and a multifamily housing component, you advertise it as a subdivision, multifamily housing, and development plan review. We, as a planning department, we feel confident that as it appears on your agenda is appropriate and consistent with Rhode Island law. The comprehensive permit is an evaluation criteria that is contained in a section of Rhode Island law, which gives the applicant the ability to vary from the standards contained within your regulations. We don't have an application form in our department that says subdivision, comprehensive permit, major land development, regular, major land development, comprehensive permit. This is a major land development. The category that appears on your agenda is, conceptual master plan review, major land development project. That is the regulatory category for this development. They're utilizing the comprehensive permit process under Rhode Island law. Our review of the law doesn't say if it's a comprehensive permit, your agenda shall reference that fact. So I'm of the opinion, and again, I'm not an attorney, that the notice that was posted for the hearings doesn't need to be renoticed. It's still a master plan review major land development for District 5 associated with the 70-unit apartment complex. From a process standpoint, they're utilizing Rhode Island law, which allows them to deviate from the standards contained in your zoning and land use regulations. The second aspect is the requirement to post notice on the property. We realize there may have been a gap in that notice. It's we'll use the term yard sale signs, but our public hearing notice signs that appear on the properties were put out by the applicant. At some point in time, they recognized, I'm not sure the background of how they recognized, that sign was no longer on the site. The applicant's representative came into our office, paid an additional $50, purchased, or it really borrowed, another sign from us to post that. It's been my experience in most instances, someone removes that sign, it does not disappear because of the wind, it does not disappear because of an environmental condition, it is physically removed from the property. Our regulation does require it to be posted for X number of days on site. Again, you could argue that if you delay the hearing another month and the sign stays there for another month, but short of having someone stand there, sit there, be there 24 hours, they're doing their best to put that sign there, but that's potentially an administrative defect. So there are two items that I think can be rectified. I'll defer to our legal counsel about the need to re-notice because of an agenda item that the applicant feels lacks the term comprehensive permit. But I think that agenda item is valid, and you could proceed under that. The difficulty with renoticing is to hold your January 23rd meeting date. We have, in essence, less than a little over 24 hours to write a legal notice and make sure it gets in the paper
So
and make sure it's done correctly.
I would say, I agree with the points that Jamie made. I think this goes back to that the applicant and the town, we're in agreement that there are issues, we just disagree with what they are.
Yep.
That being said, if the applicant is willing to extend us the amount of time that they may need to address some of the issues we raised, if they want to take a belt and suspenders approach and reword some advertising or, put the sign back out there and put the proper date on the sign, obviously we'd have no objection to that if they wanted to take that approach. But I think, as Jamie said, if you want to make sure all those things are squared away, it just takes some time. And the other thing I would say is, I know that there's been some requests for continuance, and I certainly wouldn't blame Mr. Landry for that at all. I think it makes a lot of sense, measure twice, cut once.
Yeah. Yes, and obviously the board wants to be on solid, sound legal ground as we move forward with adequate time to review and for public input, so.
Thank you, Pat. And if I may, I appreciate your patience and understanding. Obviously, we do want to take that belts and suspenders approach, and I think it is debatable whether or not the word comp permit needs to be in there. Prior to the March hearing and that memo we received on March 20th, we tried to figure out what the town needed from us by way of adding a request to amend. I sent at least 3 emails to you, Jamie, your office, and I copied Peter. I never got a response. I even called his office. I specifically asked what additional information you need from us for that request. So we did try to solve that problem, and it was suggested to us that we could not proceed on our application unless we had a separate request to amend the plan first and then came back on our comp permit. And I think council and I both agree that it can be done under the comprehensive permit mechanism. But I do think, out of an abundance of caution, because of the position the town has taken, is that it should also be advertised as an amendment to the 98 master plan. That's what's been done before in South County Commons. You have other decisions to that effect. So I just respectfully We did try to address that. I sent emails that went unanswered. I left a message, and eventually I got that March 20th memo, and it was a week before the hearing, so.
So, go ahead, Peter.
I guess the only other point I would add, and I'd put this to counsel for the applicant, it is whether or not they would consider sending the abutters notice out again.
Certainly.
To the, so that the entire perimeter of the plan would receive notice.
I mean, we obviously have a difference of opinion on who needs to be included as an applicant and notified. It hasn't been done before. That's never been required. If you want us to re-notice this to the abutters that we did, including the full perimeter of South County Commons, I'll do it, but I don't think it's necessary. It's never been required in the past.
So just going to the timeframes,
Yes, I was just about to pull up a calendar.
your kind of meeting schedule is you have a work session scheduled for May 9th. You have a regular meeting scheduled for the 23rd. I think the applicant's suggestion to grant you an extension to the 23rd is relevant with regards to public testimony and their ability to present their experts to you. But I think it's short-sighted on the planning board side to think that after maybe 2 or 3 hours of public comment, both on the applicant side, a butter side, staff side, your ability to aggregate all that information and formulate a motion that evening is extremely difficult. And I think asking a lot of the planning board. Your next regularly scheduled meeting after that is in June, June 27th.
May 1st is Monday, isn't it?
Excuse me?
May 1st is next Monday, so we're,
Yeah, so you're tight. Again, there's, my experience working with the planning board is, word this correctly, I have seen no direct intent to delay action on any application before you. Some people may view your deliberation as intentional delay, but I view that as being thorough and being conscientious of both the applicant's testimony as well as the public and your ability to weigh that against the regulations. Again, there's some uniqueness to this because it's complicated by that previously approved master plan. I think Mr. Landry's referenced that in the other 4 districts, they proceeded from the master plan directly to preliminary plan, but in those other 5 districts, what they were proposing didn't contradict any restrictions that were placed within the district, so it was, we'll call it a 1-for-1 or a existing use for another type of existing use that was both permitted in the master plan and permitted within the regulations. There's a unique aspect to this. I think in some aspects it's also complicated too, and based on testimony in January, that Mr. Landry specifically stated that the restaurant on the Route 1 side is not part of this application. As they're looking to amend their master plan, I'm not sure if it is or isn't, because their parking scenarios contemplates parking in the hotel, contemplates parking in the apartment complex. And if the restaurant isn't part of this plan, then the restaurant needs to be fully parked. And the parking for that restaurant was within the hotel field, and the overflow parking is what they're utilizing for the apartment complex. So I think there's maybe a potential oversight there. But again, all of these things can be addressed through additional time, testimony, and administrative processes.
so Jamie, I was just looking at the calendar. Do you have a reasonable suggestion for a time frame? That's what we're trying to get to here, I think.
Madam Chair, I don't want to cut you off. I'm only authorized to continue the deadline. I obviously appreciate, it's a tough position. All the expert reports and the testimony that's expected, it's been in the record for several months. They're going to testify as to their reports, and, I think it is relevant. I know it's tight, but I'm not authorized to extend the deadline beyond the next hearing date.
What has been in the record? We haven't seen traffic testimony or...
All of the expert reports have been submitted with the initial, but prior to the January hearing.
Not to the planning board.
It was all submitted via correspondence on January 13th to the board. So all those documents and supplemental materials have been
We
submitted to the
haven't
town.
had testimony about it.
No, I understand, and there will be testimony. I guess my point is, any relevant testimony is going to relate to the reports that are already part of the record.
I think, I'm just going to, we need more time.
We do.
I don't see how we can possibly have one hearing, as Jamie said, and make a decision that evening. I just don't see it happening.
So I think we need to vote favorably to replace the master plan. Then we're going to need to vote favorably to change the hotel plan to remove the hotel.
Not until a later stage.
Pardon? Wait, sorry.
When we come back for a preliminary, assuming everything goes forward and the master plan were to be approved, we would come back at a later stage with a new preliminary plan that changes the hotel plan. And we would be amenable to a condition to that. We understand that needs to be done, but it would be premature to amend the preliminary plan without having an appropriate master plan.
But you'd ask us to approve enough parking for the apartment, snitching parking away from the restaurant before we've eliminated the restaurant from play?
I think we're getting into details that Jamie has already mentioned, so I think at this point, we're just trying to come up with something reasonable. And Mr. Landry, you've been involved in this district and South County Commons for how long?
At least a decade, a while.
So I'm surprised, given that fact, that you have limited authority, and I'm sure, as being the legal counsel, you could persuade the rest of the team that it's in everyone's best interest to give us more time.
I will do so. I will state that prior to this meeting, I was only authorized up to the 19th for a special meeting. There were a number of continuances that were not at the fault of the applicant, I have to state. So my applicant is growing obviously frustrated with some of the notice issues. We've been doing our best to address those issues, but I'm only authorized to continue it through the next meeting. I will confer with my client, certainly, because I understand the board's position, but that is what I'm authorized to convey.
I got a question. I think it's primarily for Peter. And I understood your point about the original master plan and the property owners in the original plat having some interest in that, since they may have purchased it with that. So two questions. One is, maybe this one goes to Jamie, but geographically, what does that plat include? Does that include Wakefield Meadows? Does it include the rest of South County Commons? Do we know what that actually includes?
And again, I'll attempt to answer that, Joe, with counsel correcting me if I misspeak. So the question is when they amend the previously approved master plan, there's an outstanding question of whether that application is signed by, we'll say, 3 parties. The owner of the restaurant, the owner of the hotel, and the owner of the second restaurant pad. And then you look at the perimeter of that, and then you notice everybody from that point. That's kind of approach 1.
I'm not sure it's everybody from that point, right? It's actually the plat within that plat.
Then the second question is in order to amend the prior approved master plan, do you need to go back to the individuals or landowners involved in that? And I think that's where I mentioned earlier that our council, as well as the applicant's council, haven't fully vetted that issue, and they may agree to disagree. And we need additional time to work that out.
So, but where I was going with this, and I understand Peter's point, I think it makes sense from some of the things that are involved in, as far as road abandonment and that type of stuff, and where people in the plat have interest. But if people in the plat have interest, and they had some type of interest when they purchased their property, and they come here and they have a disagreement that this should go forward, what would be, I guess, our standard to allow it to go forward, even though they had a vested interest? Would it be that we would look at this and decide that, yes, it can go forward because what they are proposing, even though it was not originally approved, provides no impact, and therefore they shouldn't be worried about it? And what I'm really trying to get at is this whole idea of only one more meeting. Because if we have additional people that come here from the plat, disagree with that, and we have to vet whether there's an impact or isn't an impact, and if there is an impact, how is the applicant mitigating that such that it's negligible? This is way more than one meeting, and I'm afraid that Mr. Landry may be putting us in a position that we have to disapprove it because we can't meet the standard to approve it when people have interest and disagree with it.
So, I mean, that's a really good question. I think that really goes to the heart of the issue. I'll say that the reasoning that I've used on this is by analogy, because this is a unique piece of property and there's no case law directly on point. But what I would think of as the closest analogy would be something along the lines of a plat approved with either a right-of-way or a roadway.
That's exactly where I was going with that previous.
And so if you're going to extinguish that type of interest in a plat, the case law in that case says you need either the agreement of everyone in the plat, and if somebody comes in and says no, you're not allowed to do it. Or in certain circumstances, an individual plat owner can eliminate the condition by adverse possession. That wouldn't apply to the planning board. But I'd pause to say that is an analogy that's been applied, that's case law that's been applied to roadways and those type of interests in a platted development. I'll admit this is different, and I'll admit that there is no case that I found, and I'm fairly confident that no case that would be directly on this point. But from my review, I think you'd probably consider it the same, whereas if you were to notice it to everyone, and someone in the plat were to come in and say, hey, I bought this land with this condition, I'm an owner of this condition, it's going to affect me, that could be a real obstacle.
That was actually the case, the scenario with the abandonment of a road prior to it actually being developed, rescinded by every member in the plat. So that's actually what I was drawing off of.
Yes, Joe's absolutely correct, and I'm sure, Mr. Landry, you would not want to put those in a position of authority.
I mean, that's the biggest point of disagreement. I mean, I think it would be an absurd condition to need 200 signatures for, that would mean that they had development rights or a veto right for every project that went forward within South County Commons. The town has never required that for amendments to this master plan previously, and it would mean that every person in South County Commons, including the condo association, would need to sign off on every application that came before the board in South County Commons.
So I guess the response to that, and Jamie hit on this a little bit, is that there's been amendments to preliminary plans, because once you have the overall master plan, the different districts, they can come in right in that preliminary. And they can change their preliminary plan too, so long as they don't change it in a way that contravenes the overall master plan. So while there's been changes in the plan, for instance, there was a change in this District 5 plan to change it from one commercial use to a different commercial use. But that didn't contravene the conditions on the overall master plan. So this issue hasn't been tested yet. That being said, I'd say at the very least, we should at least give notice to all the people that are there. If they don't come in and object, then could Mr. Landry be in a position to say, well, they're acquiescing by not coming here and asserting their right after getting notice? Maybe you could make that argument, but I wouldn't be comfortable doing that until we knew that the abutters radius, the notice radius encompassed that entire area.
So not signatures on a change, but notice and letting them voice what potential impacts that they did not initially maybe conceive, and that they see that those are impacts that are significant that may
Similar,
affect
you
the
would,
property.
similar
Understanding those impacts.
to, in essence, if you were modifying the zoning map. So if Mr. Landry if this was zoned industrial, District 5 was zoned industrial on a physical zoning map, wasn't in the SMD. Mr. Landry has the ability to come in and request a zone change from industrial to something else. And then there's a notice requirement. It doesn't mean that the original owner 5 years ago of that land can object to it, or a neighbor can, you're not required to have the abutting neighbor's signature on the application to amend the zone, but it does require notice where they can object to it. The community has the ability, the town council could go in and propose to change the SMD to an industrial zone. I'm not saying they're contemplating that, but they have the ability to zone. And under the comprehensive permit process, under Rhode Island law, they give that zoning capability or reclassification to the planning board. Because under Rhode Island law, you, through the comprehensive permit process, you take all authority from all boards on all land use matters. So you take the zoning board's authority, you take the council's authority, as well as your own. So if you look at it as a rezoning of the 5th district, you have that authority under Rhode Island law. There is a process for notification, and we'll work through that with council.
And Joe, you see there's two analogies that we're looking at here. The most extreme analogy would be the road abandonment analogy, and that would require, signatures signed off on by everyone. The other analogy that Jamie just laid out would be analogizing it to like a change in a zoning of a parcel of land that you have an interest in. And that, at a minimum, would require notice and an opportunity to be heard about how it would affect you. So I think at a minimum, we could agree that it needs that notice. You need to give them the opportunity to be heard. The only other point I would add is there was a discussion about when you change the plan, for instance, changing the District 5 plan with the 2 restaurants and the hotel, you may determine, as you review this, well, residential in the back will alter the parking for the area, so maybe we want to change the overall plan and eliminate that restaurant that hasn't been built yet on front of Route 1. That's something you can consider, because you're amending the plan, it opens up the issues for you again. So I think these are all things that we're going to have to work out, and I think one thing that we'd want to build into our time frame that I think would be really beneficial to everybody would just be a time for representative of the town, representative of the applicant, and then a representative of the interested parties to sit down and think, okay, put our heads together, what can really work for everybody here.
Certainly makes a lot of sense, and that's why when Joe made the reference to, we wouldn't want to be put in a position where we needed to write a denial because we simply didn't have enough time or enough facts to really vet this project once all the legal minds have made some decisions about the process.
And I'd just add in, Madam Chair, there's 2 areas of delay. One could be a denial that because you didn't have enough time to process, or it could be an approval that gets appealed by an abutter and is subsequently overturned. Those are 2 possibilities that would be, in the long run, take much, much more time than just giving a little bit of extra time to make sure that whatever we do, it's done the right way.
The third would be, because an approval that's conditioned upon things that are extremely difficult, if not impossible, for the applicant to meet. So again, I don't think the planning board's contemplating a denial, an approval, or an approval with conditions at this point in time, because you don't have all of the information necessary to make that decision.
Yes.
So I guess I would just add, again, I'm only authorized to continue this to the next meeting. I'll confer with my client. But I think the new notice, if Peter and I could just address that, I don't know what it needs to go in the paper and what the deadline is for the next meeting. I would ask that include comprehensive permit language and request to amend the 98 master plan. And my office would agree to renotice to all the existing abutters and the abutters of the perimeter of South County Commons. Again, I don't think that's necessary. I think it's beyond what's required. The town has never required it before, but I will do that out of an abundance of caution to ensure that we've included those applicants But I just want to make sure the notice for the next hearing goes in time. And I'm happy to draft it. I'm happy to do it. It's not going to take more than a couple minutes.
Madam Chair, just if I could ask Mr. Landry, would you be able to contact your client now for authorization to see?
My client's here, he's a representative of Suffolk, and I don't have that authorization.
Oh, so there is someone here with authority.
Yeah, and I consulted with him and asked him about the deadline, and have not been extended.
Would you like to get up and say a few words? Because obviously you've been here the whole time, you've heard the conversation, you understand what's going on, so. And you're the one with the authority, so you're the one we want to hear from.
Sean Hayden, representative of Suffolk Realty. I would say at this time, we're comfortable continuing, at least to the next meeting. Beyond that, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I'd have to contact Alex Petrucci, and if we call him this late at night, I don't know how pleasant he's going to be. But at least for now, I think.
But you do understand our conversation about having one meeting at which to have the public hearing, deliberate, and have, by some miraculous act, a motion. You realize how impractical that is.
It's not ideal.
Maybe you haven't been to enough planning board meetings, but.
No, I think the position now is that we can include a new notice for a request to amend it. Again, this is out of an abundance of caution. I mean, I think we've noticed everybody that needs to be noticed. I don't think we need over 200 signatures to amend a master plan. It hasn't been required before. I've done this in other towns. We file a new master plan. It serves as an amendment to a prior master plan. I don't think we'll agree on what owners need to be included or not. I'm happy to expand the notice radius for purposes of our discussion. But again, all the materials and the expert reports from which we expect expert testimony, Eric Prevey already testified, and his materials are in the record. Joe Lombardo, fiscal impact study, Ed Pimentel's land use report, and a beta traffic report, supplemental report, and findings have all been submitted initially with our application. I sent all those materials prior to the January hearing, so they've been in the record. And I understand that there's going to be testimony that explores and expands on some of those, but the pertinent materials and reports have already been part of the record for several months.
You do understand, though, that submission of reports does not necessarily allow for for questions and answers relative to that presentation.
I understand. I understand. I appreciate it. My authorization at this point is through the next meeting. It's another month to get through. There'll be testimony that evening, and they're all part of the record, and that's just how my client wants to proceed at this time.
I mean, I suppose, ultimately, there is the time clock, and it requires the applicant to agree to an extension of the time clock if they want to. I suppose the representative of the applicant is here. I guess Alex has trusted him to call the shots tonight, so I suppose that he'd be the one to agree if he understands the issues. But short of that, that whatever they agree to, we'd have to do something within the time clock.
Right, and is there a way to leave this such that the person with the authority will call Mr. Petrucci in the morning and have a conversation with him?
And
Is that
I just add one last
reasonable?
thing.
I mean,
The other thing is that, we have to give a hearing to the applicant.
Yes.
Any other testimony, I'm sure they'd want to give live testimony, because then we get to have hearing from the abutters, and they may have testimony, so that would at least take another meeting. And then you want to have a decision that's prepared by staff. So if all we know is going to have one more meeting, staff would have to start working on a decision right away to have something, prepared for you, and that would be based off of,
nothing.
it would be based off a record that's not complete.
So, I understand the position of the board. So extending it to the next regularly scheduled meeting on the 23rd or 24th, we're amenable to do that. That's the third extension that we've given based on notice issues and other issues that have come up. My client's not inclined at this time to continue it beyond that. I will discuss that with my clients first thing in the morning. We'll discuss it, whether or not they'd be amenable to additional time beyond that. That's the best I can offer right now. It would be a third extension of time, possibly a fourth beyond May, and they're not inclined to do that at this time.
And make sure you let your client know that these 3 extensions were at no fault or bias or anything relating to this board.
No, I understand. The town, though, I mean, the notice issue was not on us. The second one I tried to address with staff prior to March, and then this one is debatable whether or not we need.
I know that attorneys like
Admit
to
it.
argue about details, but from a practical perspective, really? I mean,
The agenda was incorrect, and we have no control over that. So that first extension was most certainly not the applicant's issue, and we needed to extend that date. And the second one, as I said, questions came up about whether we could even proceed as submitted to the town. I reached out to the town on 3 occasions, followed up with a phone call, and had a discussion with Peter. I got the March 20th memo a week before that hearing, and we need to extend it to see how to address those issues.
so why don't we leave it that you'll have a conversation with the powers that be and and then speak with staff tomorrow?
Certainly.
Let's leave it that way, and we'll hope for the best. Peter?
So the only piece there that I'd be a little bit worried about is that if they speak
Date certain?
if they speak tomorrow and they say no further extensions, I think your staff would probably have to be preparing that decision right away. So I think if we're in a position tonight where we're left with that uncertainty, I'm not sure, you'd probably have to direct staff to start drafting a decision in the event that you don't have enough time, just so that they have that direction. Because if we're not gonna have the time, you're basically gonna be writing a decision. Although, I guess the alternative of what you could do, and I'd put this out there, assuming that you don't continue past the 23rd, and that's the end of it. That's your last chance and your only meeting. The case law in Rhode Island is such that the time clock is met on the meeting which you take a vote, and you can have a written decision afterwards. So I think the best thing to do would be to agree to the extension so that you can review a written decision. The second best thing may be have the hearing on the 23rd, vote on the 23rd, and then direct staff to come up with a decision after the fact. I know you don't like to do that. It's not the best way to do it.
So we're voting without having a decision in front of us. That doesn't seem like good practice, and I don't think we've ever done that before.
Are we hearing and voting on the comprehensive permit for the apartments, or are we hearing on the change to the master plan, or are they one and the same? Because one requires findings to approve, the other one requires finding if we want to disapprove. So which one are we going to hear?
I think that my position would be you'd wrap them all into one, because the comprehensive permit allows you to ask for anything.
It seems to me we'd be better off separating these two issues, because the comprehensive plan puts us in a position where we have to find to disapprove, where those issues involved in the master plan and those reasons for disapproving it is not associated, or disapproving a comprehensive plan does not address the issues in the master plan. And I'm afraid, and nothing personal with the attorney, but I am afraid that they are coming here and saying they want to push it forward because they want this to be part of the comprehensive plan. They don't want to break it off. They want to put us in a position where we cannot find anything to disapprove as it's written in Rhode Island regulations. So, from my perspective, trying to understand the master plan, trying to understand the impacts to the neighbors, trying to understand the impacts to the plat owners who had a vested interest when they purchased their land, we should be addressing this separately, and we should decide on the master plan. Let that master plan be an apartment complex, no difference whether it's comprehensive plan or not, but an apartment complex. Get a decision on the master plan, and then address the comprehensive plan, which has a total different set of approval or denial.
Yeah, it's totally different findings
Yeah.
and criteria.
They're putting us in a position, they're trying to put, maybe they're not. It seems like they're trying to put us in a position that we are only looking, we have to approve it because we can't find something that's
Yep.
disapproval according to.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Comprehensive plan.
Again, if the intent is to combine, in essence, vesting of density and the type of development in association with an amendment to the master plan, I'm confident that we can craft a motion contemplating both of those application tracks in the form of a motion, whether it's an amendment to the master plan or, in essence, approval of a master site plan for the proposed apartment. I can tell you in both instances, their parking doesn't work because in neither instance did they contemplate parking the restaurant, which is part of both applications, whether they deem it to be or not.
I think Joe's comments make a lot of sense. It seems like there should actually be two separate motions, because we're talking about two different things.
So I definitely understand the argument, and I understand it from a policy perspective. The only thing that troubles me a little bit, and, you know, I'm channeling the argument that the applicant would make, is that the comprehensive permit statute states that when the planning board sits as the local review board under the Comprehensive Permit Act, it allows you to grant basically any relief that the town can grant, and it does expressly substitute the standards for granting that relief for the standards in the Comprehensive Permit Act. So, you know, for instance, if this was just an ordinary application, they'd need to go to the zoning board and get a variance, or they might need to get waivers from your subdivision regulations, which has their own standard. Both of those have different standards. They may require relief from DPW, they may require relief from the council, but the Comprehensive Permit Act says they have the right to file one application with you only, you consider it, and when you consider it, you apply the standards that requires you to weigh the interest in getting affordable housing versus the other interests that are protected by those regulations. I can definitely see where this particular issue is sort of like fitting a square peg into a round hole. But again, you know, I would just say, you know, I just echo that this is what makes this application a tricky application, and we want to make sure we're doing it right, which, you know, and, you know, to save more time, I wouldn't say to the applicant it's limitless time or open-ended time. I would really just see it as meeting to get everything on the record, next period of time for staff to prepare a decision in accordance to, meeting to get everything on the record, meeting for you to discuss and direct staff to do a decision, one last meeting to review the decision staff drafted. So that would be 3 meetings. You do 2 a month. They've already agreed to continue to the second meeting in the month, so that really just need to capture one more meeting date, and you probably could go through a process that would allow you to, it would expedite it for sure, but would allow you to really handle all heavy issues in this application.
Yes, understood. But obviously, it is not up to this board as far as the granting of extension, and, you know, I guess we will have to wait for the folks in authority to make the decision. Jay?
I just want to point out that the application that we have and the materials that have been provided are pretty much silent to the amendment that's required. And I get it. Your intent was that your master plan submission was to replace the prior submission, but in my eyes, the problem with that is the prior conceptual master plan was for 8 different districts. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. I think what I'm saying is we need something for the file that's saying that you guys are, in fact, pursuing that, because right now the file is devoid of that conversation. I know it's come up late in the review process, but that would be something helpful for us, I think, that we would at least need that in the file, particularly due to the request of that the notice and the ad and the agenda should referenced that as well.
And I don't disagree with you. Again, I respectfully tried to address that in March. I specifically asked what we needed to submit to the town to their satisfaction to address that request. I have no problem issuing a letter to that effect.
Into our defense, I had been asking about the vesting of the property and was told that it was vested with residential use, which was incorrect. So there was a little bit of trust in listening to what was being said, and we all kind of just went along with it. But to clean it up, I just think that needs to be explained a little bit. And I did want to verify, and I can't off the top of my head remember, there was a email that we received on February 22nd that had the supplementary traffic and some other documents that were included that were sent to me. We added them to the website. I don't recall if we received them hard copy.
That supplemental submission?
Yes.
Sure, I can.
I don't recall. We may have received it. I don't know. I'm only saying that judging off of some of the reactions that were had from the board about, where is this information?
No, I understand. I think that submission came from Eric's office, and I don't know if they were made available during that hearing or not, but I'll make sure that they are distributed to the board in advance of the next meeting. And I can resubmit our expert reports, but I actually verified today that they were submitted to the town because I didn't see them on the website. And we confirmed that on January 13th, they were delivered from my office.
Okay, all right.
But I can repackage it and just make sure.
We definitely received the electronic copies. I just wasn't sure if the board had hard copies also.
Certainly. So I'll submit those to your office in hard copy form.
So, Peter, how can this board continue this hearing to a date certain if that's an unknown outcome, first of all? And then secondly, how can this even have been considered as a public hearing when it was so, I don't want to use the term counterproductive, but it really wasn't a public hearing per se. It was a back and forth legal conversation with the board in the middle about all the process details and the complex nature of the project. So it kind of doesn't count in a way.
This hearing tonight?
Yes.
I agree. In fact, we spoke before the meeting tonight, and Mr. Landry cited the things he thought were notice issues. We respectfully disagree with that, but that's fine. So, it was discussed that we just intended to just give this as a meeting to set up the other meetings where the meat of the issue would be gotten into and you could be introduced to these issues. I would say, just thinking over this now, the best, I think what you should probably do is put it on the 9th if that works for the board, which is your work session meeting. That would allow you to check back in, see what the applicant has done with regard to, and I would say to the applicant, they should let staff know by tomorrow, very right away whether or not.
Certainly.
Wait, so we're continuing a public hearing? No. We're going
Madam
to
Chair,
have
I
an
think,
update at
I
our
think
work session.
what council's suggestion is you just have an agenda item on District 5 during your work session for a procedural update, where we could report out whether an additional extension has been granted or not, and what the timing of the application is going forward. No discussion on the merits of the application or the construct of the application. No discussions on transportation, parking, building, heights, stormwater. It's really just an update on the administrative process associated with dates of your meeting.
I have a question, another question, and it's going along this thought. So I understand why the applicant wants to keep this together as far as the revision to the master plan and the comprehensive, so I get that. If we only have one meeting, then staff's going to have to do the best job they can, doing an approval and a disapproval that we can work off of. Is it possible, even though the applicant's keeping it as one, that the staff give us two motions, one motion to approve or disapprove the change to the master plan, and then one motion to approve or disapprove the comprehensive, with the decision on the first being a finding on the second? So whatever that decision be, we vote to approve or disapprove the master plan, and then when we vote to the comprehensive, either we have the finding that the master plan was approved, or we have a finding that the master plan wasn't on this other motion. Is that possible? Can we get two motions?
Yeah, anything is possible, Joe. I will work with council to formulate how that actually occurs. It may be one letter / motion that contemplates two issues. But again, a number of those issues are within the applicant's ability to resolve.
Okay, I'm sure you'll work with council. My thought is that two motions would be much better and much more supportive of whatever decision the board comes up with.
Yes, I mean, technically, this is a public informational meeting that isn't, but if you would like to come up and speak.
Good evening, Jennifer Cervenka of Cervenka Green and Ducharme. We're located at 225 Dyer Street, second floor, Providence, Rhode Island. I'm here tonight representing the Wakefield Meadows Condominium Association, and we had submitted to this board 2 letters of objection, one on February 18th, that was directly from the Condominium Association, and then another one from myself on behalf of the association, dated April 21st. There's been a lot of back and forth discussion as to what the legal requirements are, what approvals are needed. Do you need all of the plat owners to sign off on this? And I agree with your solicitor with respect to the amendment of the 1998 comprehensive plan. I just point out that in reviewing that land use plan, which was part of the approved plans in the decision in 1998, there's a specific exclusion for residential. So there's two areas, one that says what the aspiration is, 100% industrial, light industrial, commercial, and then there's a stated exclusion, and that's no residential and no retail. And we believe that that is a land use restriction that has been relied upon not only by all the plat owners, but by my client as well. As I pointed out in my letter, in 2006, when our condominium association development was approved, this board required that access be provided to this particular parcel that's being developed. And at the time, in 2006, as a matter of public record, there was no residential and no retail, where we were required to provide access for particular uses that they're now seeking to change. That requires our consent to change it. Second, which was not briefed in my letter to you of April 21st, but I was contemplating today, and I think that it is a fundamental defect in the application, is that we are an owner of the lots that are involved in this development. So there's the lot itself for the residential units, and then there's the access way. And that access way is Hampton Way. We are the fee owner, and they have a right to pass and repass by foot and by vehicle. Under your subdivision regulations, Article 5, it requires that all owners authorize the application. You do not have in your application an owner authorization from my client as the fee owner of the access way. I believe that creates a fundamental defect in the application that we've talked a lot about, authorization, whether or not this can be continued. It requires our authorization as well, and they don't have it. So if that helps this board, which I think it does, I think they have to come back to us, get our authorization, supplement the application, and then they can insist upon their timeline. One other matter just on whether or not there's the required materials on file. There's been some discussion of the traffic study. As you know, that's a supplement to an original traffic study. And as far as I can tell in reviewing records at the planning department, that was a traffic study done in 2017 in connection with the hotel development. And that was based on traffic counts from 2015, so that's 8 years old. That original study is not posted on the website. It doesn't appear to be part of the application. And then I believe that it was supplemented again at least one other time. And then this is a supplement to that supplement. So I can't quite tell what they're trying to do with their supplement, but it's not clear to me as counsel, and I'm sure it wouldn't be clear to anyone looking at the website. So I've asked for that original traffic study, and maybe it's the one I've reviewed at the planning department, I'm not sure. And I asked for it a month ago, and I still don't have it from the applicant. So I don't believe that you have in the record for your review, for the public's review, for our owner's review, all the traffic materials. And with that, I just urge this board to reevaluate whether or not you have a proper application that's before you with the right authorizations. You need a master plan from 1998 amended. You need a owner authorization from Wakefield Meadows Association, and you need supplementation of the materials that are on file for purposes of traffic. Again, 2015 traffic counts, in my opinion, would be stale. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, one administrative item, and again, I was busy this afternoon. Mr. Venkat, did you provide hard copies either to our office or bring them tonight of all of your correspondence?
Could you just go back and speak into the mic so that we can pick up your comments? Thanks.
There was some back and forth with your office, and I brought a couple of hard copies. I didn't bring 8 hard copies. I'm happy to supplement that for tomorrow, but it was unclear whether or not that I had to do that. But I do have 2 hard copies if you would like me to provide those tonight.
Again, we forwarded all the information electronically, but it is, to my view, your responsibility to provide 8 copies for the planning board.
Yeah, I had relied on the fact that the electronically it had been forwarded on to the planning board members, but obviously happy to do what is helpful to the planning department and the planning board members.
Jamie, I had several emails with Jennifer after the initial email correspondence that started. And my statement to her was that the information that got presented to the planning board gets presented in the manner that she would like it. If she was okay with it being electronic, if she felt that she wanted the board members to have hard copies, she should bring hard copy. I kind of laid that out for her. I believe she was comfortable with the board having electronic copies, but she indicated to me that she was going to bring extra copies just in case, and that's a little
Thanks, Jay.
background story on that.
So should I provide the additional copies that I brought? Okay.
If you can, thank you.
When we complete. Thank you.
Well, I thought we had a can of worms here, and now we have 2.
We do have 2.
I'm just looking at Peter saying, you want to explain all that? Or, I mean, I think I understand it, but...
Yeah. So I hope that's nice and confusing for everybody, and you'll be ready to make a decision in a week or 2. course. But I think probably the best thing to do would do a status on your work session. You'd be able to provide an update from staff about discussions with the applicant, hopefully tomorrow, about getting some additional time authorized. If you have the time authorized, then you can lay out a schedule that would be reasonable for considering this and resolving all the issues. If not, then you take the time you can work with and come up with a
So procedurally, how do we then handle the fact that this is a public informational meeting? It needs to be continued, but we can't continue it to a work session because the work session is going to be an update, and we don't really have a definitive answer from the applicant as to what the time frame will be. So how should we proceed?
And I'm assuming that
Cautiously.
Well, I was hoping for more specific.
I'll offer a suggestion, and you know, Peter can provide his counsel. I would say, since we're authorizing an extension to the next meeting date, that we at least continue it to that meeting date. But it's going to be renoticed anyway, per what we've already discussed, so it doesn't necessarily have to be continued to a date certain if it's getting renoticed, but I think it makes a lot of sense to just continue it to that date, and I'll advise Peter first thing tomorrow morning as to whether or not there's an additional extension of time.
Again, as Jamie Rabbit, Director of Planning, I would agree that you should continue the public portion of this application, date certain, May 23rd. Our intent at the work session is not to provide public testimony or weigh in on the aspects associated with the information associated with the application, other than to advise the planning board of the administrative aspects associated with meeting dates and extensions.
Thank you, Jamie. Would someone like to make the motion to continue this item to May 23rd? We have a motion from Peter. Do we have a second? A second from Liz. Any further comments?
Can I just ask a question?
Yes?
So do we have a traffic study somewhere in my pile of papers? I don't think I've seen one. Either an original or an amendment or an amendment to the amendment. Should I have this somewhere that I just don't recall seeing it?
We will go back through our distribution to you, but there should be one available to you.
Can you just make sure everything's on the website?
That's what we will do.
Thank you.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Our next and essentially final agenda item is grant applications to Rhode Island Commerce Corporation. Yeah, let's take a 5-minute break.
I still don't understand.
let's carry on and continue to our final item here. This is under reports and special items, grant application, Rhode Island Commerce Corporation, Town of South Kingstown, streetscape and facade grant applications, support letters. Jamie or Jay or who?
So, Madam Chair, our department submitted 2 applications on behalf of the town for money from Rhode Island Commerce Corporation. The first application that we submitted was a little over $800,000 for proposed streetscape improvements in Wakefield and Peacedale associated with wayfinding, street trees, street furniture, street lighting. We were asking for, I think it's $620,000, and we were matching it with 30%, so another couple $100,000 of town assets. We are asking for recommendation from the planning board to supplement that application with a letter of support. The second application was again to Rhode Island Commerce Corporation associated with a site readiness grant, which allowed for facade improvements. And there was a landowner who applied for a facade improvement for the old Feet First building. And that was a $150,000 grant that, depending on how you look at their application, they are matching with in excess of $1 million for building renovation and improvements. So it's a fairly substantial match to the $150,000 they're asking from the state of Rhode Island through Rhode Island Commerce. And again, we're asking for a support letter.
Certainly the before and after pictures are very compelling.
And the renderings are representative. We're still working with that potential landowner on, we'll say, even enhancing those improvements. So the site readiness grant criteria requires a certain amount of acreage, which this applicant actually didn't meet. It requires a certain amount of job creation. So really it's looking at vacant sites or repurposing of a building. And this was a landowner who came forward to the town based on a solicitation from the governor's office to all commercial owners. So only one person came forward.
And the Streetscape Fund has been around for quite some time, and it's very competitive. So the more letters and the more support you have, the better off the application generally will fare.
So could they fund a portion of this, and so
They can choose.
change, or how does that work if they don't receive all the funding they're requesting for this project or for your project?
So part of the streetscape application included support documentation of the town's intent to utilize American Rescue Plan funds. Right now there's $6.35 million allocated to village improvements, from landscaping, safety improvements to the crosswalks, sidewalk improvements, lighting, wayfinding, street furniture. There's a whole host of improvements. Again, that $6.x million is potentially allocated to 5 villages, and the 5 villages being Matunic, Wakefield, Peacedale, West Kingston, in essence up by Amtrak, as well as there's an area defined as a kind of not necessarily village, but it's within that village, nomenclature by Tony's Pizza and the John Deere dealership on Route 108. Now, council has discussed earlier that they may target 1 or 2 of the villages for fear that if they sprinkle the money too thinly amongst all 5 villages, that you won't recognize the improvements versus spending a larger proportion in 1 or 2 of the villages where you'll really see substantial change. So this is intended to utilize those funds and leverage them against additional state funds. So if the town was appropriating $6.3 million to the villages and they received another $600,000, they would now have 7.1 million targeted for those village improvements. But this grant application was specifically targeted for Wakefield and Peacedale.
And Jamie, the fact that the town is providing match should also make it that much more
Correct.
desirable.
Yeah.
And fundable, hopefully.
And in my initial grant proposal, I was asking for 800,000 with a $2 million match. But we were asked to bring that down.
If everyone is in agreement, would someone like to make a motion that a letter is developed from the planning board in support of this application? Okay.
I'll make that motion.
Okay. Motion from Paul, second? Any further discussion?
Sorry, just one more question. Go ahead. So there's going to be two more letters of support in addition to town council?
So we're recommending town council, planning board, as well as the Economic Development Commission.
I just want to say, I think it's fabulous.
It is
Thank you, Liz.
so long overdue.
Oh, my gosh. That Feet First site is just such an eyesore.
It will be the perfect transformational project. Yep, absolutely. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye, with one abstention. So we just need a TRC volunteer for May 10th. Oh, thank you, Joe. Morning or afternoon?
Whatever, we work at your pleasure, unless there's a conflict. Okay.
Thank you, Joe. Motion to adjourn.
Before we adjourn, I barked at Robin on the record. I would like to apologize to Robin on the record. I'm sorry.
I'm getting a little tired of speaking on this board.
Motion to adjourn. So moved. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Hey, Joe, I went to the last two